When is evidence legally sufficient for torture murder in New York? To find out, you have to read People versus Bohn, but it's 7 pages. Don't have time for that? I've got you covered. This is TLDR, Too Long Didn't Read, where I cover New York Court of Appeals cases and I try to do it in 5 minutes or less. This is the episode on the case of People versus Bohn. The citation for this case is 2024, New York Slip Opinion 01500, published by the New York Court of Appeals on March 19th of 2024. The issue in this case is the legal sufficiency of a conviction for the torture murder theory of murder in the first degree in New York. The background that I think is helpful to understand this case is first legal sufficiency. Legal sufficiency is considered. The question is whether, viewing the facts in the light most favorable to the people, to the prosecution, is there a valid line of reasoning and a valid line of permissible inferences from which a rational jury could have found that all the elements of the crime have been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. So you have to analyze all the evidence and see if a reasonable jury, a rational jury, could deduce or infer that all the elements have been established by the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. The next thing you have to understand is that murder comes in a lot of different types in New York. There's murder 2, there's murder 1, then there's a variety of theories of murder 1. Under Penal Law Section 125-27, murder in the first degree has a lot of different theories. You have to have the intent to kill a person, intent to cause the death of a person, and thereafter cause the death of a person. But there's a lot of different ways that can be done. Some of them are if the person is a police officer, if the person is a firefighter, if the person is an employee of a correctional facility. The important one for this case is sub X, which says if the defendant acted in an especially cruel and wanton manner pursuant to a course of conduct intended to inflict and inflicting torture upon the victim prior to the victim's death. And then also specifically define the terms of what that definition includes. It says, as used in the subparagraph, torture, that word means the intentional and depraved infliction of extreme physical pain, and depraved means that the defendant relished the infliction of extreme physical pain upon the victim, evidencing debasement or perversion, or that the defendant evidenced a sense of pleasure in the infliction of extreme physical pain. So in order to get the torture murder conviction, you have to show that the defendant had depravity and what those elements mean. The people must show then the defendant relished the infliction of extreme physical pain upon the victim, evidencing debasement or perversion, or that the defendant experienced pleasure in the infliction of extreme physical pain. So that's the relishment element of torture murder. What are the facts in this case? The facts are that the people established a trial. They put on evidence the defendant killed his relationship partner, and he had an extensive domestic violence relationship history with the victim. He ultimately killed her, and there's 3 categories of evidence that they put on to establish the torture element of the torture murder. First is that in the weeks prior, the defendant engaged in threats and abusive conduct towards the victim. The victim actually went to the police weeks earlier, reported the defendant. She was covered in bruises. She showed text messages or emails where the defendant threatened to hurt her, said he would sexually assault her as a penalty for lying. He said he would respond with a fury that Satan himself would envy. And while she was at the police precinct, he called, and the police overheard the defendant saying that he was going to dedicate his life to hunting her down like a dog in the street. That's one category. Second category is the night of the murder. The night of the murder, the victim actually called 911, and the jury heard the entire basically murder, or heard much of the murder that actually took place. They heard a 3-minute-long recording in which captured part of the murder, showed the defendant repeatedly strangling the victim. She was begging to be released. She was screaming. An hour later, the victim's phone call called a friend and left a voice recording of the murder continuing. This was going on for over an hour, or approximately an hour. You hear the defendant mocking her, continuing to attack her, and ultimately she was found a day later in a bathtub, dead. And the final category of evidence you hear is that the jury heard is the medical examiner testimony, which was that the cause of death was blunt force trauma to her body, testified that there were fractures consistent with being stomped. She died of internal bleeding. that it would take 5 or 6 minutes of strangulation to cause the injuries that she had, and it was very painful. It would have been very painful for the victim. The jury ultimately convicted the defendant of murder 1 on a theory of torture murder, and the defendant appealed. The defendant's argument on appeal is that the proof before the jury was that he was angry and trying to extract information from her. He was interrogating her. And that the evidence before the jury did not show that he enjoyed himself. There was no evidence of relishment as required by torture murder. The appellate division affirmed the conviction. It goes to the Court of Appeals. And here what we have from the Court of Appeals, the decision is that based upon the evidence in this case, there is evidence sufficient to establish the requisite intent to inflict torture. Why? They say, first of all, they say they reject the defendant's argument that being angry or trying to extract information is exclusive, and it would exclude relishment. They say a defendant can have mixed motives. It is sufficient if the motivation was at least a substantial factor in the murder. So if relishment and depravity and the torture element of the torture murder was a substantial factor in his emotional state, then that's sufficient. Even if he was also angry, even if he was also trying to get information. And here, because of all the evidence we have, the recordings, the emails, the evidence from the examiner, the evidence is sufficient to show that he took pleasure in inflicting extreme pain upon her. There is a valid line of reasoning the jury used, and therefore the conviction is upheld. And that's the case of People versus Bohn. If you like what you just saw and want to see more just like it, please hit like or subscribe to let me know.